Hi, and welcome back to the Life in Bomb City podcast. I'm Aaron Favor.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Beth Rodriguez.
And we are coming to you here live from the Social and Behavioral Sciences Studies Department here at Amarillo College on Washington Street campus.
Yes. Happy October. What?
Man, yeah, fall.
When did that happen?
It's here. This is the release date of the movie we were talking about the last time.
Oh, that's right.
The Sopranos, prequel.
I did see that finally, and I was like, oh, that's what he was talking about, the trailer for it. And I was like, okay, nice.
Yeah, I had to subscribe to one of the paid subscription services so that I could watch it tonight.
Yeah.
It's just going to be kind of the thing that I do tonight.
Okay.
I'm curious to see what that'll be like and if it holds the standard.
Right.
I'm sure. I mean, you got to be careful about keeping the expectations and managing them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be the same.
It won't be, but hopefully it will be close.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we always talk about sequels, right? Sequels are never the original's usually always better.
Right. And,
so,
we're always talking about, or one of the things that we talk about, one of the common themes for us is beyond what you mentioned earlier about unintended consequences, which
yes.
You're right. It is a trend that we talk about, but because it's so common.
It is.
But then there's this other thing that we mentioned, which is the border, like whenever people have that creeping annexation of morality, where you go to a border and you kind of start to see it as arbitrary, and then you move beyond it, and you're like, well, what did you call it? A foot in the door.
Yeah, the foot in the door.
Okay,
it's like you do one. It's like, well, then I might as well just do this too.
One thing that I'm looking forward to seeing is the deviant behavior of somebody like a Soprano, like in the early days.
Mm-hmm.
And this was what was so interesting about one of the many things that was interesting about the show, The Sopranos, when it was still on TV. And if you watch it even now, is watching Tony figure out how to rationalize some of the behavior that he's doing, whether it be violent behavior or other things that he's doing. And he looks at like, what you would consider to be your typical nonviolent, law-abiding citizen as just naive. And so for somebody like, Christopher Moltisanti, and in this one, it's Tony, who is a young version played by his son, Michael, for whatever his last name is. Yes, Gandolfini. Thank you, Michael Gandolfini. And I mean, in the trailer, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. The trailer says, like he's, trying to decide whether or not, he feels a sense of guilt and remorse, and his conscience is still there about whether or not he feels like it's okay to steal.
Right.
And somebody that's above him says, just tell yourself it's the last time you're ever going to do it.
Interesting.
So. Well,
I love that you actually brought this up and then you brought up your subscription that you're going to have to subscribe to. Couldn't think of the word. Which brings us to kind of what we're talking about today. We're really going to kind of delve into the idea of what technology has done. Where it's a streaming system, social media, privacy, the things that, people are able to look at because of all the technology that we're on. Mm-hmm. And then, we're going to look at all of that, right? We're going to kind of, encompass the whole story of what's going on with technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good thing. I mean, we all use it.
Right. We do. And I guess the first foundation that we need to lay is that, there's a long history of how people think and conceive of ideas of privacy and what actually, maybe by legal and societal standards, are private matters. At what times it's okay for that to be violated. And then other things that maybe are more on the realm of constitutionally inviolate, maybe even at sometimes impregnable or should be impregnable. And there's an 1890 case that at the time Louis Brandeis wrote called The Right to Privacy. And And especially with by the way, the heartbeat bill in Texas, we just in the Ranger just had an article that came out about that. And so much of that, from Roe v. Wade to present revolves around privacy.
Sure.
And clearly, there's other things that are attached
OSHA,
to it,
right? I mean, that you can't ask anybody about you really can't ask anything health questions.
Right.
You're not supposed to. Like, that's your private information. Like, I shouldn't have to tell somebody that I have something wrong. Like, I don't have to. Now, if it interferes with my work or something along those lines, then, I can be asked why am I why is it interfering with work? But someone can't look at me and say, oh, why were you at the doctor? That's none of your business. And that's kind of like this idea, the privacy idea that comes into play here.
Right. And from the beginning, it seems like that old Harvard Law Review article by Brandeis, he is kind of articulating that, he and a colleague, by the way, are writing in support of their own, at that time, I think it was the
the telephone, is that?
Yeah, it was the precursor to the telephone.
Was that where you have to?
It changed it changed the Civil War, because how fast people could communicate and get information back. But not a teleprompter. That's not. That wasn't what it was. But it moves forward. Louis Brandeis ends up on the Supreme Court, and in 1928, there is a Supreme Court case called Olmstead v. U.S. It's a prohibition case. And Roy Olmstead, probably the most successful bootlegger in American history, but not as violent as someone like Al Capone, and therefore gets eclipsed in the American mind for historically anyway, for the simple fact that they busted Al Capone on his taxes. They get Roy Olmstead though off of a wiretap, and it ends up implicating he and all of his conspirers. And the state of Washington had a wiretap law. The federal government went in, essentially violated the state's law. It becomes a massive Supreme Court case. And to this day, it holds the line of the old standard of privacy because they had party lines, and the subjective expectation of privacy on a phone call was so incredibly weak. It was very weak. So you remember in A River Runs Through It, the scene where Norm is talking to his future wife, asking her out on a date, and there was a woman on the switchboard that connects them?
Yes.
That woman would always stay on the phone and listen to what
was going on.
Yeah, I mean, they were the people that knew what was going on, and so and your neighbor could do that too. I mean, if they live 2 miles down the road, you're out in the country and they pick up the phone, they could always pick it up and just start talking, and you would never even know it. So that idea is something that is a problem for questions of is what we're saying or what we're doing a private affair, right? And so we move forward, though, 40 years into the future. The Supreme Court, by the way, Louis Brandeis writes this scathing dissent because he has this long history, a sordid past, by the way, with the Supreme Court decisions on what he's a majority and minority on and what he dissents with. But his perspective on this remains fairly unchanged, and he thinks that it's a violation of not only someone's Fourth Amendment right, but their right to not incriminate themselves, and that it kind of messes with due process and due process standards in a way that it shouldn't. And so in 1967, there's a new court case that is the kind of the modern standard for what we consider to be privacy, and that's the Katz v. U.S. case. And first of all, it's fun to just say Katz, but you do get to hear the Supreme Court, even today in oral arguments, make statements about Charles Katz, and they'll just say the Katz case or the Katz decision. And they're talking about a standard, and it's two-pronged. The first thing is they want them to be able to demonstrate that they had a subjective expectation of privacy. And then the second part of the test is that subjective expectation of privacy has to stand up to the scrutiny of society at large's standard of what is reasonable. So by the standards of the law, oftentimes it's all about reason and what's reasonable force, what's reasonable suspicion, what is probable cause, and all those other things. But for them, they're thinking about what is reasonable suspicion, or I'm sorry, reasonable in terms of expectations of privacy. Right. So, I mean, expectations, I mean, they're so subjective.
Sure. It's your perception.
Being able to understand how to manage those expectations is a problem we deal with today. And that's where I kind of wanted to leave us right here, because this is where our conversation should really take off in terms of the foundations.
Well, in my sociology class, I do an ethics and what's ethical, what's unethical. And these two cases that are brought up in the actual book for sociology, one of them, there is a researcher, right? And he is sitting at a restaurant. He is a wait staff. He's watching these people. All of a sudden, the restaurant is caught on fire. They find out it's arson. He has been observing the whole thing. He has notes on everybody who's been in and out of it. So he could, and probably, and ethically, what are you thinking? Like, maybe he should turn over his notes. But as a researcher, you are not supposed to, it's supposed to be anonymous, confidential. Anything that a research takes in should not be given to just anybody. Right. And so, that's where this ethical, unethical idea comes in. So I have my students say, why is this ethical and why is it unethical? And, sometimes it's hard for people to see why it is ethical, but it's the research part, right? The idea of privacy. Like this person who is watching you, observing you over and over, is taking notes and writing all this stuff down about you, and it's private. And, we assume, like, if we go into a restaurant or we're going to work, that nobody's just watching us and keeping tabs and everything along those lines. But this researcher was. And then the place burned down. And the cops came to him, we're telling him they're going to put him in jail if they didn't give over the notes. He never did. And they went to court and they said, well, that's research. And so it's like, oh my gosh, what do you do? And to a point, it's like, maybe you should turn over the notes, right? Because you probably know who did it. And then, you could give them some hint. And so then, but at the same time, that's the privacy, right? I mean, that's what we come down to is like, what is it? Like, when does it violate that? What is it? For every individual, your perception on, now, maybe if somebody was hurt, it would have been an easier decision. But since nobody was actually hurt, like physically hurt, I'm sure they were financially hurt, but physically hurt, then maybe that he felt, not as much like he had to give over the information. So, I mean, it's just another thing with privacy.
Right. I mean, especially with things like bullying today.
Oh, geez.
Maybe that's a jump as well.
Not really.
It's probably a little bit of a jump because it's not really research. On the other hand, people are scrutinizing other individuals, and the scrutiny of research and observations. Mm-hmm. I mean, what is a valid observation, and does it fall under the ethical premises of scholarship, expectations of ethics?
Right.
Is that
so? Okay. So tell me if you just brought up scholarship. So it just reminds me, anything that you have to apply for, or, maybe recruited for, or anything along those lines. That most people, I'm sure you do, but most people now, if they're going to interview you, they will look at your Facebook page. They're going to look at your social media. And I mean, should you be able to do that? Or is that like a private life? Should that be separated? Like, that's your private life. This is your work life. Should it be able to be separated? Like, should that be a way that we evaluate people? And I mean, according to that social media, it's a free, open platform, so anybody can look.
Right. And they make that fairly evident in the way that we post and how frivolously we go about posting things about our lives, and the pictures that we share, and how you can be swept up in pictures without even knowing the people that are in them, and with all but another thing that makes that such a big issue today is that all the different smart technologies that have been developed around that so that they can include identities associated with things like photos and friends and networks and, contact lists. And I'm not certain that Facebook has any business knowing, who is in your contact list. On the other hand, there are people that give those things willingly all the time, just for the basic convenience of being able to tag them very, very quickly, or being able to recognize a certain individual, and makes tagging easier and faster. And those are all really hard questions, but I mean, the standard is fairly simple, right? It's like, of course, if I put it out there, then somebody doesn't have to commit espionage to find it. No. It's out there. It's kind of like a phone in that instance, and a cell phone. If somebody's, using a cell phone and transmitting in public space, then what is my legitimate expectation that conversation is private? Or walking down a hallway over here, and as we see students do all the time, and myself, I'm myself included, sending a text message to, my wife or so, and yet people will walk next to you, and you don't ever know what, they're accidentally looking at, or, watching, and they can pick up on things without realizing it or recognizing it. And people are very observant.
They are. I'm nosy, but that's just the idea, is like I think we have a higher expectation of privacy than we actually possibly have. Like, we assume a lot of things are private, or that we're only showing our friends, or the person who is, intended to get the message is the only one who's getting it. And when we really look at technology in general, that's not what's happening. It's really, once it's out there, right? And it could be multiple people. And you brought up bullying, and we talk about this in my class all the time, and we talk about the idea of, bullying's not new. Like, this has been around since the beginning of time. That's just, people do social comparison. A lot of times it's like to help your self-esteem. We do downward comparison. So we often think of the bad things that somebody else is doing. And if you do it internally, it's not as bad. But as soon as you, externalize all of this, we call it bullying. And the only difference from now is the fact that cyberbullying is like tenfold, right? Because usually if you had bullying, right, it was me and the kid that's bullying me and maybe 2 or 3 people who saw, right? But now, if you put something on Facebook or Snapchat and you stick it on someone's story and you post it to all your people, who gets to see it? Everyone. And the amount of people that are exposed to that information now, and the effect of all of the thought, it's the thought of the people that you are like, oh my gosh, everybody knows, everybody saw. It's just so much bigger magnitude. And, I think that's one of the downsides, the unintended consequences of technology is, we want information to be disseminated to people. We want it to be, because that's really cool. Like, you have in your phone, in your hand, the ability to get so much information so quickly. But we also have the ability to give such negative, hurtful, awful things so at the magnitude and so quickly that, it's very painful to people. So, it's like what do we do? It's amazing. Technology is unbelievable, but at the same time, it's unbelievable. So. Right.
And it's a really good point. I don't know, what did they call that? Not just the cascading impact of that, but the exponential factor that gets put into play can do a tremendous amount of damage. And those can come in the form of lawsuits as well.
Sure.
So putting damaging information out on somebody on purpose to damage their reputation, and them being able to show, well, this was why I was fired, was because this person intentionally put a photo of me on Facebook that somehow, put me in a light that was unfavorable, particularly with regard, or made it look like something was going on when there wasn't.
Right.
There's all kinds of of ways to look at, I guess, and I'm not there yet with my kiddos being in a position where, they're dealing with this constantly. And I don't know what that's going to look like when they get old enough to have those things.
Yeah. Well, by that time, it's going to be completely different.
Right.
Because like we do Facebook. I mean, I don't know if you do, but that's like Facebook is more of our generation. It was MySpace. Facebook's the better version of this. But kids now, that's not even where they are. They're in Snapchat now. And, Snapchat, unless you save the picture's gone. Which, I mean, it's good and bad again, because then, it's like it's like that. I know it's going to be gone. So the risk factor and the things that maybe I would take a little bit more time to think about doing, I don't, because I'm like, the picture will disappear. But that's actually not true either, because someone can save that picture. So, I mean, just the idea of Snapchat is great because, to a point, but I think it heightens the possibility that people are going to be posting things that they wouldn't if they had more time to think about it, because they're having this idea that it's not going to be there very long. Right. It's just going to go away. But that's not the way it works, right? There's a lot of people who will save that. And now, you know what? Somebody has that picture. Somebody has that information. Somebody has that now. So, and it can be saved. Even though you delete whatever you delete, somebody else has it already. And so my kids, they do. My oldest has Snapchat, and I'm on Snapchat too, and I follow his story to make sure that and he knows. So, but I'm, just to make sure that, he's not posting anything that he shouldn't, or that was like, what, why would you say this, or why would you do this, and I think that's like my part. That's what I should be doing as a parent, right? Is right now, this point, social media is a new adventure for them. And so we have to be there as a parent to help them with this technology. The sad thing is they probably know so much more about the technology than I ever will. And, that's another unintended consequence, is that it is moving so quickly, and they're in the midst of it, in the constant change, that parents are behind. And even if we were to learn something new every single day, we'll never catch up, just because they're in it and it's just happening constantly. But and that's great, but it's also not great.
Right. I think that to some extent, I've got to ask the question, why is it great? Why is it so important to share all of these things with the general public? And why should we need their affirmation regarding anything? And not to say that the 90s were not a perfect time in history. Okay. I'm not like going back, the good old 90s or the 80s for that matter. But the big deal then was being able to get your own phone line. Right. That was the ability to have privacy, had to do with having your own phone line. And that was the expectation was, we're trusting you with a certain amount of responsibility. We're going to pay a little bit extra on our phone bill in order for you to have this extra line. Don't abuse it. And what does abuse look like in that setting? And how does it differ from the setting that we have today, in which people are walking around with mini computers that have eyes and ears and geolocation trackers? Yeah. It's a real question that I think deserves a lot of social discourse. There's probably a lot that's out there.
Mm-hmm. There is always. And the reason I think it's great is, again, it's just at their fingertips. They have the ability to know so much so quickly. Like the amount of information that's out there it's unbelievable. Like you could just be learning new things all the time. But there's a downside to that too, right? So we've talked about this too, as well, as that, would we really be worrying about things that are happening in Florida, unless it was posted through media of some sort? Like, we're just getting that information so much quicker. Internet, everything's just being like, this happened today and this happened. And so, at the same time, we are getting so much, and it's most of the time when we look at news, right, they have higher ratings if they can have something that's controversial or sad or traumatic of some sort, where people, tune in to see what happened next. If it's a happy story, people are like, oh yeah, that's great. But then they're not tuning back in. They're going to find, something that's like, oh, what happened next? And would we, with that information, do we have higher levels of anxiety? Do we have higher levels of depression? Are we focused more on things outside of our environment, which we can control, to the point where, we feel kind of like this helplessness because it's like, well, oh my God, like my kids are going to get kidnapped. They're going to get eaten by an alligator. They're going to, someone's going to throw acid in their face. Just all these things that we hear all the time, what maybe we hadn't heard before, because that type of information wasn't just in our hands. So it's like, I wish there was a healthy balance. Like we could shut off, like you could only hear about a couple of bad things a day, and you could, you have to hear more positive than negative, but that's just not how the world works, especially with media.
And it's not the kinds of stories that people want to share either. If someone is trying to process grief, whether it be from, I consider it to be a fairly arbitrary thing. And I know that that's maybe unfair of me to say that, because something like a high school breakup seems fairly arbitrary to me. On the other hand, it's a major emotional, affair for the people that are involved. Mm-hmm. And that's understandable, right? But tracking that, the ability to track somebody's emotional formation over time is a strange new occurrence, and maybe gives maybe certain types of institutions, systems that have more power over individuals, a little too much information to be able to make moves of manipulation. Mm-hmm. A good example of that would be, and this is not a high school breakup, by the way, this is just a real world example of what happened in Aleppo, Syria, about a decade ago, when the Syrian government started going door to door. And this was when the presidential candidate was asked, I think it was the independent, one of the independent or libertarian presidents, I can't remember his name. The candidate was asked, what about Aleppo or something like that? And he was like, what's Aleppo? He didn't know. Yeah. He didn't know what it was. But everybody or not everybody, but many people that were involved and active on social media, Twitter, all the different platforms that we have available at our fingertips, they knew what was going on, and that the Syrian government was going house to house, essentially trying to just put down the rebellion. Mm-hmm. Which is, on one hand, if you're the Syrian government, and you're in a totalitarian regime, essentially a monarchy that is a kind of a dynastic style, mm-hmm. government, their perspective on authority is very different. And holding them to Western standards, we could argue, and I think very validly, about the morality of what was going on. On the other hand, that kind of attention being paid to the individual life and dignity of the individuals involved in those, what we perceive as happening, they would say things like, heard gunfire next door, I think they're moving closer, or heard gunfire on my street. And as you could almost feel the encroachment mm-hmm. of what was going on based off of what was going on Twitter. So to take that into perspective from maybe an individual, we don't maybe need to know when, somebody is leaving their house to go down the street, and they might make an argument, well, I need to make sure that people know, just in case something happens. Right. Or, have you watched The Day I Met El Chapo on Netflix? I don't even like mentioning his name on social media. So if you're a cartel member and you're listening, that wasn't out of disrespect. Say his name. But it is a title of a Netflix film, and there's a scene in which one of the ladies involved in that adventure, if you will, as a Mexican actress, and she took a photo of the tail number of the plane that she was about to get on, and she didn't really say anything else outside of that. And I think it was fairly obvious later on when people found out that she'd done it, because if this is the last time you ever see me, or if there's here is the tail number of the plane, so do with it whatever you need to do. Not that might even do anything, by the way, when you're dealing with somebody like that. But I mean, I think that being able to draw those lines of how the power can be used to people's benefit or against other people, in the case of like a high school person, gaining a trust in a relationship that is not real or asymmetrical, like a senior and a 8th grader, or a senior and a freshman, which I don't even think may not even be legal, but
it depends how old they are.
Okay, yeah. But at the same time, that isn't kind of an asymmetrical power sharing relationship, and getting young people to understand that element of it is a really, really difficult dimension for, I think, probably anybody to really recognize. Would that be? I mean, we deal with that as adults and with things like Title IX.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yes. And that is always the idea of the power struggle. Like, if somebody actually has power over you, is it a consent kind of thing? That's kind of what you're saying, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm so glad that you actually brought stuff up, because I was, as you were, talking about some of the things, it just brought up the idea of like, it can be very useful. It can be very useful, and we do use it, but then, it can also be used against us. Like, my husband will not let me post any pictures from vacation while we're on vacation. He's like, then people know we're not there. He's like, that is just basically saying, hey, if you know where we live, we're not home. Go to our house and have a free for all, because nobody's there. He won't let me do that. But he also is he's a car guy. He will find stuff online. He goes and meets these people, which, like, I don't know who they are. He doesn't really know who they are. He's assuming that they are, trustworthy, and that this is what they're really doing. And he's done this so many times. It terrifies me every time. So what I have him do is, as soon as he gets there, I have him take a picture of their license plate. I have him take a picture of the guy. And then I say, you know what? If I call you in 5 minutes and you don't answer the phone, I'm calling the cops. And he's like, bad. I'm like, I'm serious. Like, it's terrifying. You have a check to buy a car, and it's not usually like a $5,000 check. You're buying a car, and these people, I don't know who this person is. You're meeting them in random places. Like, he'll drive places, and he's not even in Texas sometimes. And I'm like, how do I know that you're safe? So I will track him, and I'll call him, and I'll be like, oh, how's it going? If you don't call me, if I text him, and I'm like, if you don't call me in the next 5 minutes, I'm calling the cops. Why are you not answering? And then when he does, he's like, I'm fine. I was test driving. But I think, in that sense, it's like, I do have that ability to know where he is and what's going on. But at the same time, so is it not just me? Like, who else knows exactly where he is and what's going on? And that's kind of where we see this whole idea of privacy and, what really is private.
Right. And then you make an excellent point there. To go back to the Aleppo, Syria incident, which is the more of the extreme end, but is very crucial to what you're saying. Does Twitter have an obligation to allow those messages to get out, and then outrage the world, and make them feel terrible about everything that's happening? Mm-hmm. Or do they have an obligation to turn it off, in an effort to prevent the Syrian government from knowing who's where and still alive?
Yeah.
And that is another major question and element of that power and how to share it, because it does cut both ways.
Sure.
On one hand, people may know more about it, but if the regime doesn't care, they know how to silence those people and where they are.
Sure.
At least if they have really robust communications.
Well, it's kind of a show of the times, I guess. Like when you were saying that one candidate was like, what is that? And then we have like Donald Trump. Right. President Trump was on the social media, And we constantly were hearing everything he had to say. You know, it's like unfiltered, immediate, responses. And, some people were just like, whoa, like, wait, but that's kind of how the time was. It's like, that's the point of social media and Twitter. It's like you put it out there and then you're like, oh, what did I just do? And sometimes you're having to take it back or backtrack or delete the post altogether. And that's what we see a lot of people do. And I don't know why people were so shocked to see him, get on those types of social media, this types of, grounds that everybody could see. Because that was kind of the point, right? Is that's the point of what those are for. And so he wanted to make sure that he was also had a presence there. Even some of the things that he posted, I was just like, God, why do they have somebody who is watching this? We need a social media advisor. Like, wait, you can't post that yet. Let me make sure it looks like that. But then that's not the point of social media, right? It is the immediate emotion, the response that comes with it. And that's what we usually see people do, which as parents, especially parents of teenagers, right? We realize that that's not what we want to happen. Like, social media can't be the place where you just throw it out there, because it could come back and bite your ass.
Right.
And that's the biggest issue with social media.
Certainly. And that, to kind of contrast that, what we have now with President Biden is we've seen the trend to go silent instead of answering questions, walking away, instead of posting extra information or information that is going to seem controversial. It's just a quiet, like, void that then gets filled with other people's speculation and whatever their expectations from a previous time was. So is the cat out of the bag with regard to those people's expectations of and the transformation of communication with their constituents, or even using that as a tool for misinformation with other countries or with people in general? We see things that have happened, and how fast the problem of having a constant and consistent message can be through this COVID-19 pandemic has really backfired.
Sure.
As you just indicated, it may not be the place to just throw stuff out there all the time.
Right.
And I don't know, it's a very complicated matter.
It is. And see, it's the unintended consequence of technology is, we would hope, we would almost like have the expectation that when people post things, they're posting like factual information, not just stuff. And but that's not what's happening, right? We have this immediate, it's almost like a response rather than a thought out thing. In class the other day, we were talking about some of these things along this line. And I said, I was asking the students, I said, what happened to, if you don't have anything to say at all, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And I said, and that's not the way it is anymore, especially on social media. If you feel like you have something to say, it doesn't matter if it's nice or not, you're just going to say it. And it's like, where did that happen? When did the whole, golden rule of treat people the way that you want them to treat you? And it's changed. And it's almost like the idea, like, if you've ever seen any of the purges, most of the time, the people who do purge, who are part of it, they put masks on because they need to be somebody else. And that's kind of what it feels like now, is what social media has allowed you to put this mask on and just kind of say whatever you want to. And which is crazy, because then people don't expect the backlash from it. And then they feel threatened, or like somebody is, being mean to me. And it's like, well, I tell my kids all the time, don't hit somebody, because you're going to get hit back. Like, you can't assume that if you do what you do is not going to have a retaliation. So you have to think before you actually respond or act, because there's going to be a reaction no matter what happens. That's just how life works. Okay. And not everybody will say, well, you hit me, but I'm not going to hit you back, because that's not how it's work. That's just not how it works.
Yeah. In an ideal setting for someone who is, that you should turn the other cheek, right? I totally understand what you're saying. That's there's a reason that's in the Bible, as opposed to being something that we just kind of expect to happen all the time, every day. Is that it's just not typical human behavior. And by the way, if we were to take the modern social media, the opportunities and the tools, and put it back into the time of the 1950s or 1960s, would that have been a positive thing for the civil rights movement, or would that have been a negative thing for the civil rights movement? Or is it neither here or there, or is it somewhere in the middle? I mean, we know that, for example, the war in Vietnam was dramatically changed by the use of media to, for example, put the light of the Tet Offensive into a negative cast, and as opposed to the some of the other things that we maybe look at, like the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where we have embedded troops and they're doing whatever. And I mean, is it right for us to be able to see what the troops are doing live? I mean, this is one of those questions, and it's only accelerated since then. And so if you put that into that context, I mean, during that time period of the civil rights movement, the FBI had a program from 57 to 72 called COINTELPRO. It has been in a more dramatic light today as a kind of a reaction brought up by the Black Lives Matter protests and movements, where they're rediscovering or maybe reframing some of the heroes of that civil rights movement, including Malcolm X and we had those conversations in class all the time,
right?
And the way that the FBI was going about that, on one hand, they have a duty to protect the country and the homeland from foreign powers. Then we know that there are foreign powers in the country working to undermine the United States form of government, that are trying to use groups of people and interests of people against the United States of America. One of the roles of the FBI is not just a law enforcement body, but also a body that is a national institution, is to protect the sovereignty of the United States and its ability to make decisions. Well, how do you affect the United States of America and its ability to make decisions, if not through the people and manipulation of those individuals? We heard this recently with the elections, right? But the big thing for them back then was, or one of the issues, I suppose, was that it came out that the FBI was spying on Martin Luther King. I mean, this is not a surprise. Martin Luther King was a major social leader at the time. If you're the FBI, you're concerned with the matters of somebody like Martin Luther King. Sure. He didn't have a reasonable expectation of privacy to the extent that people thought he did. And that's not me being critical of his social beliefs, right, or his political beliefs. But rather looking at the national interest perspective, that people were going to infiltrate certain groups and elements of his to make sure that he wasn't some type of a Trojan horse or doing something that he really shouldn't have been involved in. What ends up happening is it kind of reveals extramarital, relationships, and then that gets used to discredit Martin Luther King, and that becomes a whole different issue, right? Yeah, because you have this infiltration and sabotage as opposed to just collecting information and intelligence. And what do you do? It's nothing will be perfect.
Right. And that's the thing, is like, when is it too far? Like, when did you step over the line? Is that something, is his, what those decisions, did that really affect his movement? And how, it's like what information do you give people? If we're going to give it all, then we really need to give it all. And it doesn't need to be shaded or, halfway, only telling one side of the story. Like, if we're really looking at journalism and news and, everything, if you're going to have the information, then, and we're going to use bits and parts, then you need to give the whole story. Right. There's no bits and parts, right? We've seen the different, like, I just saw this, I was scrolling through, which I I don't do very often, but I do enough, usually to get people's birthdays. I'm like, I think someone's birthday is today. Oh,
that's really what social media should be about, is just making sure we celebrate other people's
that's kind of
births.
My thing. I forget. I'm like, oh gosh, I missed so-and-so's birthday. But I was just scrolling through and it was like, it showed a picture of a lion. It was a lioness actually holding her cub. Okay. But she has in her mouth, because that's how they carry them. And one side, it looks like it's eating the cub, and then they turn it around and it's really the head's on the other side, and it says, what media shows you and what the reality is. And it's like, why should that be the way it is? And it shouldn't be, right? I mean, the idea of journalism, and it's very basic, is to give information, all the information, all the facts, to get as much information about everything and let you decide. Like, where did the letting the people decide thing go away?
Well, I mean, at what point did we ever decide that people were capable of sorting through all that information and arriving at a conclusion that's not only reasonable by other people's standards, or maybe by and how do we rate that? I mean, that's kind of where the free market comes in journalism, is that we have the invisible hand that's always filling the void of whatever the people want. And this is a major aspect of it. And my classes, we talk about this a lot, is, how much time do we actually have to devote to critical thinking about the world around us? And how much, as we've discussed, how much should I care about a hurricane hitting New Orleans? Not to say that I shouldn't care. Of course I should care. But how much should I care? Because there's only so many things. Yeah, I mean, there's only so many things that I can deal with if I'm a husband and a father, and I'm working a full-time job, and all of my emotional energy, all of my physical energy, all of my my intellectual energy are going to other things as a student, as a teacher. I mean, what do I have left to give at that point? Do you want my money now too?
Right.
I mean, at what point do I just let it go and just say, you know what? They're going to have to figure that out. We have our own problems right here.
Right.
And we need to be dealing with those. That's a major question in journalism, I think, for our generation, is finding those things, because I'm certain that in the past you would find out that there was a hurricane, but it happened 2 months ago. And while that's awful and terrible, and we should always be hoping and praying and, trying to figure out how to help other people, maybe a good response to that, a healthy way to respond to that would be to know that it happened, but it's not happening as we speak. And people getting on and doing a live stream of it the whole time, so that we can see the trees, pushing the houses off into the rivers and flash floods, or whatever the case. I mean, it reminds me of that childhood song, that we always we may have been exposed to. Be careful, little eyes, what you see, and be careful, little ears, what you hear. It's not so much it's not just a spiritual thing. It's also this. Hey, I mean, we're in our own orbit, and we can control the things that we can control. We can't control the things that we can't control, but we are in a society and in a time when we believe, for some reason, I don't know where we got this idea, that we can control everything, or we should be able to.
Right. So, I mean, just thinking about everything and all the problems and all the stuff that's happening, it's a very anxiety-provoking, stressful way to live your life. Right. I also have another lesson we do in our class over stress. And, I have everybody write down, all the class, like they're in their own groups and they're coming up with the top 3, top 5 things that stress them out. And then we write them on the board, and they're almost exactly the same for everybody. And as we sit, and I'm like, okay, now I need you to tell me why they stress you out. And when we really look at it, it comes down to, it's not these things that stress you out. It's the way that you respond to them. So this real stressor is you. And, and then we talk about what it does to the body. And I end the lesson by basically telling them, you need to prioritize. You need to figure out what's important to you and control the things you can control. Like, I can't control how other people drive. I can't. I mean, there's nothing I can do about that, but I can control my response to it when somebody makes me mad, right? Instead of, getting angry and like running into them or, flipping out, getting out of the car, whatever, my response can be, I can laugh it off and say, you know what? I pulled in front of someone before. I get it. Like, hey, have a good day. You get to choose that response. That's what you can control. So therefore, instead of trying to assume that now that's a bad driver, so I should be stressed about it, and oh my God, why? Like, why would you do that? And that's kind of what you're talking about is like, those things are stressful and anxiety provoking. Like, oh my gosh, like, what are those people going to do? Where are they going to sleep? And it can cause a lot of extra pressure and stress and anxiety that, there's really not a lot you personally can do about that. But what you can do is control what you can control. And that's you, possibly maybe a little bit of control over your kids, but you can really control how you respond to the things rather than, you can't fix it all.
Right. And so what do we say? What do we say to institutions that attempt to change it all? I mean, for example, the Department of Justice in this recent, asserting control or attempting to assert control over the state's decisions to make a ruling or to have a legislative body, which is the process,
Right.
electing people and then them making decisions. As controversial as it might be to somebody from New York, and money can pour into the state of Texas to create, a context of bad press or whatever the case may be, that might prompt the Department of Justice based on the pressures that are being asserted in different committees and in different lobbies and all the interests that go into these things to make a show of it.
Yeah.
And to try to figure out how to, when in reality, the real methods of control, and maybe I'm showing my age here, by saying, by referencing something that Justice Scalia, talked about with regard to privacy. And I think it's really important to note, especially in regard to things like people that are deeply concerned about something like the heartbeat bill in Texas, that this was an expectation that was created, probably with good intentions, that has kind of metastasized into what looks like a right. And the way that we describe rights and liberties, civil liberties, are guaranteed, and you cannot have them removed without due process.
Right.
A civil right, though, is something that evolves over time. So a civil right is not maybe the right way to frame that issue. And maybe it was a part of the culture of the 1960s to say, from the court's perspective, that they overreached a little bit. And in 1973, overreached again. And I mean, this is something I'm not taking a position on,
Right.
but rather just kind of discussing the way that Scalia talked about it when he was alive. Something that he argued was, that was never decided by the American people. And in a republic, it's the people that determine what the laws are, not a court.
Right.
And that's fascinating because if you've never thought about that from the national legislative level and from the level of the presidency, that the Supreme Court's job is not to rule on these types of things and change societal norms, but rather to judge a range of issues. And even some of those are controversial because they've been, some people look at the Marshall Court, the very first one, as being an activist court, and I mean, I don't know what the answer is. It's just more to think about.
It's, it's always, it seems like things should be, it's very simple, but it's because of the human emotion and everything else that goes into it and different perceptions and experiences that make things more complex. And so even though, when we can look at an issue and say, okay, this is it, there's always a, but what if, and it's, and that's when it makes it, a lot harder for people to jump on board, if that makes any sense. It's like it's just the more information, the more perception, the more experience, that whatever's happening, it just makes it a lot more complex than this easy idea of this is what we want and this is just how we should get there.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I cannot believe that you and I are continuing to talk about, I think we could, as we always say, we could always continue talking about this.
We can have another show.
I've got this thing in front of me, and I just now saw Ernest Hemingway. It's not really. Oh, it was just referencing the fact that the FBI had files and dossiers on John Steinbeck, Ernest Hemingway, Charlie Chaplin, Marlon Brando, Muhammad Ali, Albert Einstein.
And why did they have them? Because they were influential people. I mean, it's like, what could this one person who is very influential do?
Because they have power.
Yeah.
And now we have influencers, not necessarily even movement leaders, but influencers, as we saw with the White House bringing in this TikTok influencer.
Probably, yeah.
And of course, on TikTok, it makes sense. But in other areas, it doesn't. Nobody knows who this person is because he's a TikTok influencer. And the term influencer is a whole, it deserves its own podcast, I think.
Yeah, probably.
Because we could go from the micro all the way up to the people that are able to, know all the algorithms and can generate 1 million shares, or I don't know, that seems like a lot.
And I don't know. I think it probably is done.
Yeah, it probably has been done quite a few times.
It's just crazy. I think that, we just, the biggest difference, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that, I'm sorry, that I'm not against technology, and I don't understand all of it. I mean, even you're more technology, I don't know, you have more knowledge in it than I do in the first place, but I see, how it can be helpful. And I also see the downside. So we see that, the benefits, and we don't want to stifle, our kids, the public, but at the same time, maybe we don't want them to have all that information. We don't want them to be able to see all of it all the time, whenever they want, nonstop. It's like anything in moderation is okay. But that's the excess. That's when it becomes an issue, where we're starting to see major problems for people, for kids, for societies, for countries, for political parties, for movements. I think that's when, we get to the excess, that we're starting to see the downside.
It's really well said, and I totally endorse what you just commented on, which is typical of me at the end of an episode, because I know that both of us are looking at the clock, going, "Okay, our listeners start tuning out about an hour in."
Yeah,
and yet I can't help but want to just make one little addition about the TV show Naked and Afraid.
Yeah,
one of the things that's so alluring about the experiences that they're having isn't the fact that they're out in the wild; it's the fact that they've been, it's almost like the physical representation of them being naked is just it's not something that's interesting as much as it is, they've been, everything that is comfortable has been taken away. So even the things that from the very beginning, we say make people feel ashamed to be around each other without clothes is taken away. So even the most basic comforts, not to mention water and food and
the necessities.
The necessities, the things that we take for granted every day. So being able to focus on one specific thing for an entire day. So for instance, you see every now and then you'll see somebody work to build a fire for 12 hours. And it is frustrating to watch. On the other hand, you kind of envy them in a way, because you know that all of their faculties, their mental faculties and their intellectual faculties are being put to the purpose that they were originally designed for, which was to survive. And I think that people wanting to get back to that is something that's really cool. And at the same time, for instance, when we look at our phones, it's not really something that maybe human beings were built.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to have to learn how to deal with it. It's not going away.
Right.
And I'm with you. I'm not a Luddite, and I don't want to be.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the truth is that, to some extent, we're going to have to figure out how to find a balance, as you said.
Balance.
And find out when it's appropriate and healthy to concentrate on something as simple as building a fire, if it's even only for an hour or 30 minutes, and keeping it going and learning the basic tool of, keeping oneself warm using a fire, as opposed to, doing that, letting the gas, turning on the gas, lighting it up as fast as possible, getting that fix. And then we can have the aesthetic of the fire so that we can feel like we've got a fire. Good. But it's not really doing,
it's not the same.
It's not the same. So anyway, that's just more of our, food for thought. But it has been 1 hour. I can't believe it.
Went
but
really fast.
Yeah, always. Thank you so much. And for listening, everyone. We're looking forward to getting to visit with y'all again.
Yeah. Have a great weekend.
Have a wonderful weekend. It is, it's going to be fall break before we know it.
Yep.
So y'all take care. And, is this the first day of fall, or was that back?
I don't know. I just know it's the first day of October.
I know it's the first day of October, and in addition, I think it's kind of cold, which makes me think fall. So
sure it is.
Anyway, all right. Well, happy autumn, everyone. Bye.
Bye.